Obinna was a man whose name had become synonymous with triumph. At just 40, he was already a legend whispered about in the gleaming boardrooms of Victoria Island and toasted in the lounges of Silicon Valley. The boy from Enugu who once soldered broken radios now commanded a digital empire stretching across continents. His company, Nebula Systems, powered the financial arteries of Africa with cutting-edge fintech innovations, while his investments in renewable energy made him a darling of international conferences. At the peak of his glory, Obinna lived a life most only dreamed of, perched high above the chaos of Lagos in his glass-walled penthouse at Eco-Atlantic, with the Atlantic Ocean glittering endlessly beyond. The lifestyle was nothing short of cinematic. His garage held machines that could silence traffic on Ozumba Mbadiwe just by their presence. A Bugatti Chiron in midnight blue, a Rolls-Royce Cullinan in pearl white, and a sleek Tesla Roadster he had personally imported. His private jet bore his initials, O.N., etched in gold across its tail, and his yacht, the Aurora, had hosted heads of state and music superstars. Dinners with Obinna were power plays, lobster tails plated with precision at his long mahogany dining table, laughter laced with strategy, and wine flowing as deals worth billions crystallized beneath the city lights. To Lagos society, he was not just a man, he was an untouchable myth. And then came the night that would change everything. It was his 40th birthday, and Obinna wanted to make a statement. The venue was unlike anything Lagos had ever seen. A floating glass pavilion anchored on the Lagos Lagoon, its transparent walls giving the illusion that guests were dining on water itself. The chandeliers sparkled like frozen rain, and soft jazz spilled from the grand piano where a young prodigy played. Politicians, celebrities, fellow billionaires and business partners filled the room, each dressed in their finest, each aware that being invited tonight meant they had been chosen to orbit Obinna's universe. Obinna arrived last, stepping into the pavilion with his striking wife, Amara, at his side. She wore a shimmering silver gown that seemed to ripple with every movement, her beauty as calculated as it was natural. The crowd erupted in applause as waiters lifted glasses of Dom Perignon. Fireworks were scheduled to crown the night, but for now, the air was thick with admiration. Obinna smiled, his tailored tuxedo sharp against the glitter of the Lagos skyline. Cameras flashed, drones hovered above, and for a moment, the billionaire stood as the embodiment of Nigerian aspiration, proof that anything was possible. The night unfolded like a carefully written script. Toasts were raised, stories told of Obinna's rise from a struggling university dropout to a global tycoon. Friends clapped him on the back. Enemies cloaked their envy behind champagne smiles, and his family watched with eyes that seemed to shimmer a little too brightly. His father, once a struggling trader in Onitsha, sat quietly in a corner, pride and silence etched across his aging face. His younger siblings hovered near the buffet, whispering among themselves. To Obinna, it was all noise, all spectacle, for tonight he wanted to breathe in the height of his achievement, the empire he had carved from sheer vision. Then came the fireworks. At exactly 11:59 p.m., the pavilion lights dimmed, and the glass walls reflected the sudden blaze of colors shooting into the night sky. Gold, red, and green exploded above, their shimmering trails mirrored in the lagoon below. Guests gasped in delight, raising their phones to capture the magic. Obinna, ever the showman, excused himself from a conversation with the Minister of Finance to step closer to the glass edge of the pavilion. He wanted the world to see him silhouetted against his own spectacle, the fireworks bowing to his glory. But in that moment everything shattered. The glass, beneath his polished shoes, trembled. A sound, subtle but sharp, rang through the night, drowned almost instantly by the boom of another firework. And then, with horrifying suddenness, the billionaire's figure lurched forward. Gasps filled the room as Obinna plunged downward, his body colliding against the railing before disappearing into the shallow deck of the pavilion. The music screeched to a halt. Amara's screams split the night. Chaos erupted. Guests rushed forward, but security locked arms, forcing order into panic. Obinna lay sprawled, his tuxedo torn, his body frighteningly still. Someone shouted for a doctor. The fireworks above now seemed cruel, mocking, their brilliance a sharp contrast to the tragedy unfolding below. Hours later, sterile hospital light replaced the glamour of the pavilion. Machines beeped rhythmically beside Obinna's bed, wires clinging to his body. The verdict was swift and merciless: spinal damage, paralysis from the waist down. The man who once stood tall above empires might never walk again. The news spread like wildfire across the city. Headlines screamed in the morning: Nigeria's tech titan crippled in tragic fall. The stock market wavered, investors whispered, and rivals smirked behind closed doors. But inside his hospital room, what stung most was not the pain in his body, but the betrayal etched on the faces around him. His siblings came with forced tears, their eyes betraying an unsettling relief. Amara clutched his hand tightly, but when she thought no one was watching, her gaze drifted with calculation. The empire felt suddenly fragile, as though his fall had opened the gates for vultures to circle. And then, in the stillness of one restless night, Obinna heard it. Through the half-open door of his hospital suite, a voice low, chilling, deliberate. "Now he's weak," it said, the words dragging like knives. "It's time." Obinna's eyes widened in the darkness. The fall might not have been an accident, after all. The sterile scent of disinfectant had become Obinna's new reality. Days blended into nights within the hospital suite, and though the skyline of Lagos still glimmered through the window, it now looked like a world he could not touch. The empire he once commanded from glass towers now seemed to tremble without his voice, and in the shadows of his silence, the wolves began to circle. His siblings were the first to reveal their teeth. Chinelo, the eldest sister with a poised elegance and razor-sharp tongue, called Tobechukwu into her SUV one humid evening, the leather seats absorbing their whispered schemes. She had always felt that Obinna's success overshadowed her own life, reducing her accomplishments to footnotes. Tobechukwu, younger, reckless, and perpetually broke despite his brother's endless bailouts, nursed his envy like a festering wound. Together, they spoke in hushed tones about transition, about stability, masking their greed in the language of family responsibility. They agreed the empire needed new leadership, a face untainted by scandal or weakness. In reality, they wanted his throne. Their whispers spread like poison. Cousins and uncles who once bowed to Obinna's vision now started angling for their slice of the kingdom. In ancestral compounds in Enugu, elders muttered about heritage, claiming that bloodline rights meant Obinna's fortune was never entirely his to keep. The family WhatsApp group, once filled with pictures of newborns and Sunday lunches, now buzzed with coded messages and subtle positioning. To them, his paralysis was an invitation. It was in the boardroom, however, that the betrayal became undeniable. Obinna insisted on attending, even from his wheelchair, rolled into the marble-floored conference hall by a discreet nurse. The room was a theater of masks. Directors who once applauded his vision now smiled with pity, their eyes darting toward Chinelo and Tobechukwu seated at the far end. When Obinna raised questions about a new investment plan, answers came delayed, evasive, and deliberately patronizing. Someone even muttered, "Perhaps you should rest, sir," as though his injury had damaged his mind as well as his legs. Cold smiles sliced through the room. The billionaire, who once spoke and watched the room lean forward, now felt his voice echo hollow against walls that no longer belonged to him. Back at the hospital, the betrayal deepened. Staff who once scurried at the sound of his footsteps now whispered openly. Some avoided his gaze, others took longer to respond to his calls. Power, he realized, was not just in money, it was in the aura of invincibility. And with that shattered, people revealed their true loyalties. And then there was Adana, his glamorous fiancée, who once paraded him like a trophy at fashion weeks and champagne soirées, began to retreat. At first, her excuses were subtle work commitments, exhaustion, business trips, but soon, the absences grew glaring. When she did appear, she perched at the edge of his hospital bed like a visitor, her eyes skimming the walls rather than meeting his. She still wore the engagement ring, but her laughter now belonged to other circles, her social media filled with events where Obinna's wheelchair presence would have been an embarrassment. Her silence was a sharper betrayal than any word could be. The media joined the chorus. Headlines shifted from awe to doubt. Can Nebula Systems survive without its founder? Read one front page. Another simply declared, Fall of a Titan. Television analysts speculated about mergers, takeovers, and succession plans, speaking of him as though he had already been buried. Obinna watched from his hospital bed, rage and sorrow mixing in his chest. Every word was a knife. It was in these lonely nights that his mind traveled backward. He remembered a childhood of scarcity, of meals stretched thin, so his siblings could eat. He remembered selling second-hand electronics in the Enugu sun to pay Chinelo's school fees, and the countless times he covered Tobechukwu's debts to keep the family name unsullied. His empire had not been built alone, it had been built with sacrifices, with blood, with loyalty. Yet here they were, sharpening their knives while smiling at him through glass. The betrayal ate at him. It wasn't just the loss of power, it was the erasure of everything he thought family meant. The hospital walls grew colder each night, and he began to wonder if the greatest wound was not in his spine, but in his heart. And then, one evening, as he attempted to wheel himself toward his desk, he saw it, a folder left carelessly open, a document half slipped from its file. His name was there, his signature too, but he had never signed it. His heart thudded as he leaned closer, reading the words. It was a transfer of shares, a legal maneuver, stripping him of controlling interest in Nebula Systems. The ink looked fresh. His fingers trembled as he traced the forged signature. The wolves were not just circling, they had already begun to feast. The mansion that once stood as Obinna's proudest achievement had become a cage of silence. Perched above the Lagos Lagoon with its sweeping glass walls, infinity pools, and imported Italian marble floors, the home had once been alive with laughter, business meetings, and the rhythmic pulse of music spilling from late-night parties. Now, every corridor echoed with the sound of his wheelchair wheels, each turn reminding him of how much space he no longer owned with his presence. What was once a palace had turned into a prison, every luxury item another reminder of what he had lost. The staff who had once rushed about at his command had changed their tones. His chefs, who used to boast about preparing meals fit for kings, now served bland, careful dishes as though his appetite had shrunk with his strength. His maids no longer looked him in the eye, speaking in whispers as they adjusted his curtains or polished the glass walls. Even the guards at the gate, who once saluted sharply whenever he passed, now lowered their gazes, treating him not with respect but with a suffocating pity. Their silence cut deeper than words ever could. And then came Adana. She arrived one morning, her perfume lingering in the air even before she entered his study. She stood tall, her beauty undimmed, her voice practiced and calm. "Obinna," she began, avoiding his eyes. "You know I love you. But I can't marry a broken man." The words fell like glass shattering against marble. Broken. She had reduced him to a single word. She spoke of her youth, her dreams, her right to live a life untethered by sickness. Then, without tears, without hesitation, she slid the diamond ring from her finger and placed it on his desk. For the first time in years, Obinna could not find words. He simply watched as she walked away, her heels clicking against the polished floors, echoing like a countdown to emptiness. When the front doors shut behind her, the silence that followed was unbearable. It wasn't just the loss of a fiancée, it was the confirmation of his deepest fear, that he was no longer desirable, no longer strong, no longer worthy of standing beside anyone. Friends vanished soon after. The phones that once buzzed with invitations to private island getaways, international conferences, and art auctions grew quiet. Messages went unanswered, calls faded, and even those who had sworn brotherhood began to travel indefinitely. His social world, once wider than the Atlantic, shrank into nothing. The very people who once begged for his attention now acted as though he no longer existed. Even his driver, Musa, a man who had been with him since the early days, began avoiding his gaze. Their drives together had once been filled with jokes, Nollywood gossip, and warm laughter. Now Musa only spoke when necessary, eyes fixed firmly on the road. His voice stripped of warmth. To be powerful was to be seen. To be powerless was to be invisible. And so the nights became his torment. Obinna would sit in the main lounge, facing the lagoon through the endless glass wall. The water shimmered with moonlight, carrying with it memories of what once was. He would replay his rise in his mind. The nights of coding in cramped apartments, the breakthroughs that put him on the global stage, the moments when he stood taller than presidents. In those reflections, he was still unstoppable, still invincible. But then reality crept back in the silence of the house, the absence of footsteps, the wheelchair beneath him. Depression crept in like a thief. His appetite dulled, his laughter faded, and his once manicured appearance grew disheveled. There were mornings when he did not want to rise from bed, when even breathing felt like a task. The luxury around him became suffocating. The chandeliers mocked him with their sparkle. The spacious rooms echoed with loneliness. He could have traded all his wealth for one simple thing: to stand again, to walk unassisted across the marble floors of his own home. And yet, beneath the despair, there was a stubborn ember of pride that refused to die. Obinna was no stranger to pain. He had faced hunger, rejection, and failure before. Somewhere, deep inside, a voice reminded him that paralysis of the body did not mean paralysis of the spirit. His pride, bruised but alive, whispered that he could not let the wolves win. That ember glowed faintly, unseen by others, but it was there waiting for air. One night, as the city hummed faintly in the distance and the lagoon glowed beneath the stars, Obinna sat once more in his wheelchair, staring at the reflections in the glass wall. His mind drifted, heavy with memories and fatigue. But then his heart jolted. Among the shimmering reflections, his own weary face, the glittering lagoon, another figure appeared. A stranger's silhouette stood faintly in the glass, motionless, watching. Obinna turned sharply, his breath caught in his throat. The mansion was supposed to be empty. The stranger's reflection was not a thief or a ghost, but a woman calm, steady, and disarmingly ordinary in a mansion of extravagance. Her name was Amara Okafor, a nurse from Enugu. She had come on assignment to Lagos, her transfer arranged through the hospital after Obinna's personal physician recommended additional care at home. She arrived without ceremony, carrying nothing but a simple leather handbag and a determined air that contrasted sharply with the marble floors and glittering chandeliers of Obinna's fortress. Unlike everyone else in his orbit, Amara did not bow. She did not gush over his titles or adjust her voice into reverent tones when she spoke. She looked at him as though he were just another man, her gaze steady and unflinching. It unsettled him at first. Here he was, Obinna Nwachukwu, a billionaire whose signature could bend economies, and yet this woman spoke to him as if he were no different from the patients she tended in the hospital wards. Their first meeting was a collision of worlds. She found him sitting in the lounge, brooding at the glass wall as usual. "You look like someone waiting for pity," she said flatly, setting her bag on the floor. He turned sharply, his pride bristling. No one spoke to him that way. Not his board members, not his family, not even his fiancée, former fiancée, who had left him with that cruel word, broken. "Excuse me?" he asked, his voice tight. Amara shrugged, pulling a chair closer without asking permission. "I've seen men in worse states still fighting to live. You, on the other hand, sit here in this palace, drowning in silence. Do you think wealth exempts you from suffering?" The bluntness cut deep, but it was not cruelty, it was truth. For the first time since the fall, Obinna felt the sting of someone daring to strip away the layers of his arrogance. Her presence was different in every way. She did not bring gourmet meals prepared by foreign chefs, but trays of steaming jollof rice, roasted yam with palm oil, pepper soup spiced to the bone dishes that reminded him of childhood. The aroma filled the mansion with a warmth that no Michelin-starred dish had ever achieved. At first, Obinna resisted, sneering at the sight of her stainless steel flasks. But when he tasted them, the memories came rushing back. Afternoons in Enugu with his mother cooking over charcoal, evenings of laughter before ambition consumed his life. He ate slowly at first, then hungrily, surprising himself. Amara never coddled him. When he complained, she mocked him lightly. "So, the great Obinna can build satellites in the sky but cannot lift a spoon by himself?" She teased one evening, her smile quick and mischievous. He stared at her in disbelief before breaking into laughter. Real laughter, raw and unrestrained. The sound startled him. It had been weeks since it escaped his lips. The walls of the mansion seemed less suffocating that night. She shared her own stories too, weaving her life into his. She spoke of her upbringing in Enugu, the struggles of paying her way through nursing school, the nights she worked double shifts just to keep her mother's medicine stocked. She told him about her fiancé, a man she had loved deeply, who abandoned her the moment she lost her father's inheritance to a bad investment. "He called me a liability," she said, her eyes holding pain but not weakness. "I learned that people only love you when you are useful to them." Her words echoed his own unspoken wounds, and for the first time, Obinna felt someone truly understood. Their bond was fragile at first, stitched together by honesty and vulnerability. He found himself waiting for her visits, listening for her footsteps down the long hallways. She did not worship him, nor did she pity him, she simply saw him. And in that simple act, she gave him something that wealth, power, and fame had failed to provide: the dignity of being human. Slowly, Obinna began to feel alive again. Conversations with Amara lit sparks in the ashes of his spirit. He began to ask about her favorite books, her opinions on politics, her dreams. In return, he spoke of the days before his empire, of the little boy who once fixed radios in a dusty Enugu shop. There was a rhythm between them, unspoken but undeniable, and though neither admitted it, both felt it grow. One night, after Amara had left and silence reclaimed the mansion, Obinna drifted into sleep in his wheelchair. His dreams were unusually vivid. He saw himself walking no chair, no weakness across the shimmering floor of his glass mansion. The moonlight poured through the walls, and in his dream, he was not alone. Amara walked beside him, her hand warm in his, her presence steady and real. Together, they stepped into the light. Obinna awoke with a start, breath heavy, his chest tight with longing. For the first time since the fall, he did not wake up in despair. He woke with hope. Whispers move faster than cars on Third Mainland, and in Obinna's mansion, they slipped under doors and along polished corridors like restless spirits, carrying the scent of judgment. The family had already decided that Amara did not belong, not in their glass-walled world, not beside a man who once strode through airports with ministers trailing him like shadows. So Amara learned to visit quietly, sliding into the evenings like a soft hymn after a storm, choosing the back entrance where the hibiscus hedges met the service lane. She carried nothing ostentatious, just a cloth bag with a book, a scarf if the lagoon breeze turned cruel, and a patience that outlasted pity. Their meetings became a ritual of rebellion, gentle, steady, and free of spectacle, as if love could take root only where noise was forbidden. Those evenings were stitched with music. Obinna would cue his old high life playlist, the same songs his mother once hummed while rinsing rice in a metal basin. And Amara would smile at the crackly horns as though greeting old friends. Sometimes she played the piano in the corner, letting lean melodies float into the ceiling hymns, folk tunes, stray bits of Debussy learned from a church volunteer who taught her scales for free. They talked between notes, took turns pausing to listen, and filled the silences with an intimacy that needed no translation. When conversation ran out, they wheeled onto the balcony. Lagos poured its shimmering lights across the lagoon, and the constellations, faint, stubborn, rested above the city's hum. She pointed out Orion with a nurse's precision. He matched it with a child's awe, thrilled that something so ancient could still be found from his private prison. What surprised Obinna most was the way happiness re-entered his bones through the smallest doors. The sound of Amara's laugh, that quick bell of mischief when he made a joke at his own expense, the warmth of her palm steadying his shoulder as he transferred from chair to couch, her habit of straightening picture frames and scolding the wind for its untidy hands. He discovered that joy could be granular. The curl of steam from her tea, the damp halo on the table where her cup rested, the faint scent of shea butter rising from her wrist when she tied her scarf. He had always loved grand gestures, fireworks, press releases, showpiece donations, but now he found himself hoarding the modest splendors of human nearness, like a man counting coins in a power outage. He tried, once, to buy the sky for her. A jeweler arrived discreetly with a velvet case, the stones bright as gossip. Amara laughed and closed it with 2 fingers. "You cannot bribe sincerity," she said, eyes soft but unwavering. "Keep your diamonds for people who invoice their affection." He stared at her, stunned by the relief that washed through him. She wanted truth, continuity, presence, no curated romance, no carefully staged gratitude. That refusal was its own vow, that she would not be adorned into silence, would not be purchased into complicity, would not trade the honesty between them for the comfort of spectacle. Their closeness deepened on a diet of ordinary things. They cooked on weekends her pepper soup, his clumsy attempt at okpa over a recipe call with an aunt who still called him Obinna Nwachukwu, and ate by the window while the lagoon mumbled to the pilings. She teased him into physiotherapy drills with a referee's whistle purchased from a roadside vendor, insisting on one more set, one more lift, one more reach toward a version of himself he could almost feel returning. When he faltered, she folded a towel under his elbow, lifted at the right moment, and said, "Again." In the stubborn chorus of her "again," he heard a scripture he could actually believe in. Weeks earlier, every silence in the house had sounded like failure. Now, the same silence felt like concentration, 2 people listening for the rhythm of healing. Warnings found her anyway. A friend from nursing school cornered her by a vending machine and dropped it like a diagnosis. A billionaire's heart is dangerous territory. Too many exits. Too many spectators. An older matron couched it in concern. Men of power outsource their conscience. She absorbed the cautions without flinching, went home to her studio flat, and stared at the water stain on her ceiling while her mind replayed the careful way. Obinna asked, "Are you warm enough?" before wheeling her closer to the heater when the night breeze nipped. She knew risk when she saw it. She also knew gentleness that was learning to trust itself again. The world could mislabel both. She chose to keep showing up. For Obinna, the horizon shifted. The future no longer looked like a single corridor ending at closed doors. He began to sketch possibilities in the margins of his days. A rehabilitation wing he would endow at LUHH. An app for at-home therapy gamified with Yoruba proverbs and Igbo idioms. A mentorship fund for nurses who wanted to redistribute dignity, not just care. He saw himself returning to boardrooms without the hunger to dominate them. He saw his life refusing pity's narrow script, widening into a tender usefulness Amara had unlocked with her insistence on honesty. It happened on a night the city lost power. Generators across Lagos rose in a grumbling chorus, and the mansion exhaled candles from every surface. Amara lit them slowly on the piano, on the bookshelf, along the balcony rail until the rooms glowed like a chapel. Their faces learned each other again in that warm flicker, shadows deepening every smile, every blink. The playlist was unnecessary. The lagoon composed its own lullaby, and the wind braided it through the curtains. He told her about his first bank loan, the way his hands shook signing papers thicker than his confidence. She told him about the day she nearly quit nursing, the patient who clutched her fingers and said, "You are my proof that angels do not always have wings." He rolled closer. She stood still. He lifted his chin. She lowered her guard. The kiss came without fanfare, candlelight skimming her cheek, gratitude spilling down his spine like rain on a hot roof. It was careful, then certain, then inevitable. A seal pressed onto wax, a promise that did not need a courtroom to make it real. But houses have ears, and envy loves an audience. A servant had paused in the hallway, tray balanced on one palm, curiosity stronger than caution. Through a narrow gap where the door refused to close completely, eyes recorded what hearts had just discovered. Later, as the candles guttered and the generator steadied into its midnight hum, the servant slipped down the service stairs, crossed the courtyard where the hibiscus slept, and tapped at a waiting car window. Inside, two faces turned with the same greedy patience that had followed Obinna since the fall. The tray, the hallway, the kiss, the report came out in precise, trembling sentences, each detail, a coin placed carefully into an open palm. By dawn, the story had left the mansion. His siblings were already awake, assembling a plan. The wolves were smiling again. It began with an invitation that felt more like a summons. Chinelo and Tobachukwu appeared in Obinna's study, flanking the doorway like prosecutors, their faces composed but their eyes sharp. They did not wait for his greeting before unleashing their grievance. "This girl," Chinelo said, her tone laced with disdain, "is manipulating you." Tobachukwu leaned forward, his voice raised. "She is not here for you, Obinna. She is here for what you represent: money, power, and a name that can drag her from obscurity into society." Their accusations piled like stones, each one intended to suffocate. They claimed Amara's visits had distracted him from critical business, that she was a nurse-turned-actress playing her role too well. The subtext was clear: she was an intruder, and they wanted her gone. Obinna sat in silence, his jaw tightening with each word. It was not that he had not anticipated their disapproval, he knew his family too well for that. But their audacity still stunned him. The siblings who had eaten from his palm now dared to dictate the terms of his companionship. They threatened openly. Amara would no longer be allowed through the mansion gates. If he insisted, they would instruct the staff to bar her, dismiss her, erase her from his world as though she had never existed. The storm gathered quickly outside the mansion walls. Adana, his ex-fiancée, seized the moment with the instinct of a predator. A leaked photograph of Amara entering the mansion at dusk appeared on a gossip blog with the caption, "From ward to penthouse, nurse bags Nigeria's most eligible disabled billionaire." On television panels, Adana's friends spoke slyly of village opportunists who used sympathy to climb ladders they did not build. Hashtags multiplied across Twitter, memes followed, and the whispers that began in corridors now roared across Lagos. The staff, infected by the new narrative, shifted their treatment of Amara. What was once courtesy turned into mocking stares. Snide comments dropped like crumbs along her path. Someone deliberately spilled water on the floor near the kitchen where she walked. Another laughed loudly when she carried her simple food flasks into the dining area. They smirked at her sneakers, her headscarves, her refusal of luxury cars. Humiliation crept into the very air of the mansion, tightening its hold on every step she took. Obinna watched it all with burning fury. For weeks he had swallowed insults, endured pity, and borne betrayal in silence. But when the mockery turned toward Amara, something inside him snapped. In a meeting where Chinelo sneered at Amara's presence, Obinna wheeled forward, his voice steady but sharp. "If you disrespect her, you disrespect me." The words silenced the room. For the first time since his fall, he raised a shield not for himself, but for someone else. The declaration rippled beyond those walls, a public stand in defense of the woman they despised. The siblings, however, did not retreat. Instead, they escalated. Tobachukwu began holding clandestine meetings with board members, whispering of Obinna's fragile state and emotional instability. Chinelo courted shareholders with promises of stability if control shifted away from her brother. Their ambition turned feral. Suddenly, hostile moves against Nebula Systems began surfacing proposals for asset sales. talks of restructuring, rumors of foreign investors circling like vultures. What had started as family quarrels was mutating into open corporate warfare. Through it all, Amara remained. She could have walked away, bruised by humiliation and weary of public ridicule. Instead, she arrived as always, her steps calm, her presence unshaken. "I did not come here because it was easy," she told him one night, her voice firm. "I came because you need someone who sees you, not your wealth. If that costs me my pride in the eyes of others, so be it. I will not leave." Her devotion anchored him in ways no business achievement ever had. For the first time since the fall, Obinna felt emotionally unbreakable. He was still trapped in his chair, but inside, he stood taller than he had in years. Yet the storm had not reached its peak. Late one evening, Obinna rolled quietly down the corridor, intending to fetch a file from the study. He paused when he heard muffled voices bleeding through a slightly ajar door. Chinelo and Tobachukwu again, joined by two board members, their tones urgent and conspiratorial. "We can't wait any longer," Chinelo whispered. "We begin the transfer of core assets this week, sell them quietly before he notices. By the time he finds out, it will be too late." Obinna froze, his pulse thundering in his ears. The empire he had bled to build was being dismantled in the shadows. The wolves had sharpened their knives into swords. He had always trusted silence more than applause, and now, in the hush of his midnight hours, the quiet became a weapon. What he built in secrecy, structures nested within structures, signatures buried in vaults only he could open, began to stir like giants waking underground. The wolves thought they had mapped his kingdom. They didn't know about the passages beneath the palace. The memories returned like blueprints unfolding. Years earlier, in the feverish surge of Nebula Systems' ascension, Obinna had learned the cost of visibility. Competitors tried to corner his patents. Politicians hovered, hungry for leverage. So he built a second spine for his empire. A lattice of holding companies incorporated in steady, law-abiding jurisdictions, stacked with layers of trusts and governance rules that required only one wet ink authorization, his. He called the framework Kite, because it looked delicate to the untrained eye yet rode any wind. Within it lived the crown jewels. Algorithmic patents underpinning Nebula's payments engine, trademarks for key product lines, cloud licenses, and server nodes that quietly controlled the operating tempo of partner banks across 3 continents. He had never boasted about Kite. "You do not advertise the locks on a vault you plan to keep." His siblings, drunk on their conspiracy, moved against what they could see: office leases, public subsidiaries, the sparkle-tinted assets that photographed well. They did not reach the heart. They did not even know where the heart was. While they whispered with restless investors, Obinna opened an encrypted channel to the one person he knew would answer without bargaining: Adewale D. Akinlabi, an old ally who had left Lagos to run a boutique legal tech firm in Amsterdam. D was brilliant where the law met code. He could turn compliance into choreography. When Obinna's message arrived, brief and bleeding urgency, D replied with a single sentence that made the mansion's air feel breathable again: "I kept everything you asked me to keep." They spoke by night, the lagoon a black mirror beyond the glass. D steered him through dormant provisions buried in dusty binders, call options defining thresholds, poison pills keyed to unauthorized asset transfers, a clause that rerouted operational permissions to Kite if a director's incapacity was exploited by hostile parties. To trigger the mechanisms, Obinna needed presence of mind and proof of malice. Luckily, his enemies had been generous with evidence. Voice notes, emails, an accidental memo forwarded to the wrong private secretary. Obinna gathered every shard and arranged them like cold jewelry on his desk. Amara watched the return of his focus with a quiet pride that refused spectacle. "Fight smart," she told him, tying her headscarf before making tea. "Not loud. Loudness feeds them." He nodded, feeling the ember within him gust into a steady flame. She helped him adjust the braces on his legs for longer desk hours, set alarms to remind him to stretch, and left bowls of roasted groundnuts by his keyboard, because she knew his hands wanted something to do when his mind hit a wall. When fear visited, he met it with work. When rage rose, he poured it into strategy. The nights grew industrious again. The wheelchair became a command chair, the study a war room. He mapped timelines, drafted directives, and rehearsed the sequence with D until the calls felt like prayer. At 2:17 a.m. one morning, he logged into a hardened console and shifted a sliver of license control from a public subsidiary to a Kite node. No alarms blared, no headlines screamed. Yet, miles away, A bank sandbox flickered, then waited for a handshake that would not arrive until he said so. He did not cripple anything. He merely reminded the system who held the keys. By week's end, the first ricochet arrived. Nwachukwu had promised a buyer in Dubai access to a minor payments module as a proof of influence gesture. The demonstration froze midstream, authentication denied by a signature invisible to everyone at the table. The buyer frowned. Nwachukwu bluffed. The buyer left. Later, a procurement pipeline Chinello had dangled before a European fund insisted on patent verification. Their due diligence bot returned a polite refusal. Trademarks held in a senior entity, requiring principal consent. Consent belonged to one person. That person had not granted it. The siblings raged in private, then masked their panic with more plotting. But the media, skilled at sniffing blood and miracles, began to ask the right questions. An investigative journalist published a chart with a curious caption, "Who controls Nebula's core?" The piece didn't accuse, it simply observed that while public filings showed turbulence, system uptime remained immaculate, and licensure checks routed to a quiet cluster. Comment sections wondered, not unkindly, if the founder had anticipated betrayal and engineered around it. On breakfast shows, analysts spoke cautiously of underlying governance intelligence. Amara brought the newspaper to the balcony. "They sense it," she said, "but they cannot prove it." Obinna, let the breeze rattle the pages. The old vanity tried to rise, to celebrate the cleverness of the maze he had built. He tamped it down. Vanity had no role here. What mattered was time. He kept his cards hidden, resisting the urge to sting them with public victories. He would strike only once, when retreat for his enemies was no longer possible, when the law and the markets would both nod. So he waited, tightening knots. He filed quiet notices through D that would mature like timed seeds, board consents revocable upon evidence of coercion, arbitration clauses anchored in friendlier ports, a stewardship mandate that redirected dividend rights to a trust with philanthropic objectives, certain to make any aggressor look like a vandal if they interfered. Each move was a stitch. Each stitch made the net stronger. Then midnight came, carrying the city's soft diesel hum and the weight of a confession he had not asked to hear. The doorbell's chime was modest, almost apologetic, as if it already knew it had no right to sound in this house at such an hour. Amara had gone home an hour earlier. The guards announced the visitor with a confusion that smelled of old habit and fresh scandal. She stepped into the light of the foyer, hair immaculate, perfume careful, eyes rimmed in sleepless pride. Adana. She did not sweep in like a queen. She folded. Palms together. Voice low. "Obinna," she said, the name breaking on her tongue. "I made a terrible mistake. Please, forgive me." A storm had named itself family. Now another storm walked in on high heels, begging for shelter. Adana's presence in the mansion was like perfume lingering in a room long after its owner had left unwanted yet undeniable. She stood before Obinna that midnight, her eyes gleaming with the polished sadness of someone who had rehearsed her apology in front of mirrors. "I was foolish," she whispered, sinking into the velvet chair opposite his wheelchair. "I let fear blind me. I let your fall scare me away. But Obinna, I see now, I should never have left." Her words carried the sweetness of contrition, but beneath them lurked the hunger of a woman who had tasted influence and could not bear to live without it. She painted pictures of a future together, gilded in loyalty and public restoration. "With me beside you, we can silence the whispers. I can stand with you again, show the world that love is stronger than tragedy. Your family, the media, they will fall back in line." Each syllable was bait, a careful mixture of devotion and ambition. Obinna listened, expression unreadable. His chest tightened at her voice, for she had once been the keeper of his dreams. Before the accident, they had danced under Parisian chandeliers, toasted in Dubai penthouses, shared secrets whispered between champagne flutes. Memories flickered, seductive in their familiarity. For a moment, the ache of betrayal wavered under the weight of nostalgia. Could she truly mean it this time? Could her return be more than strategy? His mind fought, but his heart stumbled. Yet even in his hesitation, a wall remained. He remembered the word that had cut deepest broken, and the way she had left without tears. Her promises now tasted of desperation. "You are late, Adana," he said finally, his tone steady but laced with fatigue. "Where were you when the world turned its back on me? But ghosts are stubborn. They do not vanish when dismissed." Obinna began visiting more often, slipping past the gates under the guise of reconciliation. She arrived with silk scarves, imported perfumes, and carefully prepared home-cooked meals that the staff whispered about with delight. Her charm returned with venomous precision, and even the guards who once saluted Obinna began murmuring that Madame Obinna might be back in her rightful place. It was not long before Chinelo and Tobechukwu welcomed her into their strategy sessions, their smiles thin but eager. She offered them gossip from the mansion, and in return, they offered her sympathy cloaked as alliance. Inevitably, Amara noticed. It began with the subtle shift in Obinna's mood, the silences that stretched too long, the way his eyes sometimes wandered to the past instead of the present. Then, one evening, she arrived unexpectedly and found Obinna in the study, standing too close, her hand lingering on Obinna's shoulder as though it still belonged there. Amara froze at the doorway, the betrayal slicing deeper than any insult she had endured from his family. The nurse who had given him laughter and hope suddenly felt like a trespasser in her own love. She said nothing that night, but her silence screamed louder than words. When Obinna called, she answered briefly. When he reached for her hand, she pulled away. He noticed the absence of her laughter, the withdrawal of her warmth. For the first time since her arrival in his life, Amara closed her heart, not out of hatred but from the raw sting of feeling second best. The love triangle brewed in shadows, each side laced with jealousy and secrets. Obinna whispered to the staff that Amara was temporary, a nurse who mistook compassion for romance. She seeded doubts in Obinna's siblings, promising that her return meant stability, that she could help control him in ways Amara never could. Her words spread like smoke, choking every corner of the mansion. Obinna found himself torn, dragged between history and truth. Obinna's familiarity tempted him, her perfume laced with memories of easier times. Yet Amara's authenticity burned brighter, the proof of devotion etched in every sacrifice she had made. His body was paralyzed, but his heart was caught in a storm of movement, pulled in two directions at once. Silence became his shield. He spoke less, smiled rarely, avoided confrontation. But silence was its own betrayal, and Amara's heart cracked beneath it. She began to stay away more often. Nights that once belonged to music and laughter now belonged to emptiness. Obinna wheeled to the balcony alone, staring at the lagoon, feeling the void widen. Amara's absence was not noisy like Obinna's schemes. It was quiet, suffocating, devastating. The nurse who once filled his home with warmth was slipping away, and he was powerless to stop it. But truth has a way of surfacing, sharp and undeniable. One evening, as Obinna sat reviewing files on his console, an encrypted message arrived from D abroad. Attached was a recording, its timestamp from just days earlier. The voices were unmistakable. Obinna's lilting cadence, smooth and persuasive, mingled with Chinelo's sharp tone and Tobechukwu's careless arrogance. "He still trusts me," Obinna said in the recording. "I can steer him, soften him. Once he's distracted, we can finish the transfer quietly." The room spun. The ghost lover who begged for forgiveness was no penitent soul. She was an ally of his siblings, a conspirator in his undoing. Obinna's fingers clenched the armrests of his wheelchair, fury and heartbreak colliding in his chest. Love had not returned to him, it had crawled back hungry for power. The mansion's air turned electric the night Obinna summoned Obinna. She entered with her usual grace, perfume preceding her like an army of illusions. But the smile she offered faltered when she saw the console glowing on his desk, a file open, speakers already primed. Obinna pressed play. Her voice filled the room, sharp and undeniable. "He still trusts me. I can steer him, soften him. Once he's distracted, we can finish the transfer quietly." Chinelo's answering laughter rang like knives. Tobechukwu's arrogant chuckle followed. Obinna froze, then snapped. The apology mask cracked, replaced by venom. "You think you're clever?" she spat, her eyes blazing. "You were nothing without me, Obinna, nothing. Do you think that little nurse will ever stand beside you on the world stage? I was your crown, your mirror, your shield." Her words dripped with rage, but Obinna saw them for what they were, desperation dressed in nostalgia. "You were my mistake," he said coldly. The dismissal burned her more than the recording. She stormed out, heels striking the marble like gunfire, her final glare promising vengeance even in defeat. The ghost lover was gone, but her shadow lingered, spreading poison in whispers she had already planted. In the aftermath, Amara nearly left for good. She had seen too much, felt too much, the silence, the hesitation, the lingering glances at a past that should have stayed buried. Her bags were half packed when Obinna wheeled into the guest room, his voice breaking as he begged. "Don't leave me, Amara. I was blind, but not anymore. You're the only truth I have left." Tears cut through his pride. For once, he spoke without armor. Amara hesitated, her heart torn between pain and loyalty. She stayed, not because the wounds had healed, but because love was stronger than dignity in that moment. Yet her silence was heavy, and Obinna knew he was on borrowed time. Meanwhile, his siblings tightened their grip on the empire. Board meetings turned into orchestrated trials, every proposal of his blocked with sly motions and majority votes bought with promises. Tobechukwu strutted through the offices as though he were heir apparent. Chinello spoke in interviews, claiming Nebula needed stable leadership, unburdened by personal challenges. For a moment, it seemed the fortress might finally crumble. But Obinna had prepared for this moment all along. In one decisive move, he unleashed Kite, his hidden fortress of companies. With D's guidance, he transferred operational rights back to himself, executing clauses buried deep in contracts that invalidated hostile decisions made in his absence. The patents, licenses, and trademarks his siblings thought they controlled reverted instantly to his signature. Overnight, their schemes dissolved like salt in water. The shock was seismic. Banks scrambled, shareholders demanded explanations, and the media erupted. Front pages screamed, "The billionaire's resurrection." Television anchors replayed the timeline of his downfall, only to marvel at his rise. Analysts praised his foresight, calling him a master architect of corporate resilience. For the first time in months, Lagos celebrated Obinna again, not as a crippled man abandoned by fortune, but as a strategist who had outplayed his betrayers. But victory is never simple. In the midst of his triumph, Amara vanished. One morning, her room was empty, her few belongings gone. No word, no farewell, no explanation, only silence. The rumors filled the gap with cruelty. Blogs claimed she had been paid off by his siblings to disappear. Some suggested Adana's allies had threatened her. Others whispered that she had realized love was not enough for a life under constant siege. Obinna tried to call, to reach her friends, but her number no longer connected. Her flat stood empty, her trail dissolved into air. He spiraled again. The taste of victory turned to ash. What was the use of saving an empire if the one person who gave him reason to fight had abandoned him? Nights became restless voids once more. He stared at the lagoon, the city lights blurred by unshed tears, his hands shaking on the armrests of his wheelchair. The journalists wrote about his miraculous comeback, but he felt no resurrection, only hollowness. Then, one evening, as he rolled into his study, he saw it. A single sheet of paper lay on his desk, its edges trembling faintly in the draft from the open window. No envelope, no signature, just 8 words written in neat handwriting. "If you want her back, find her in Enugu." His heart slammed against his ribs. The note trembled in his hand long after he had read it. Enugu. The city of his boyhood, the cradle of his earliest dreams, the place he had left behind when ambition drove him to Lagos's glass towers. To return there now felt like peeling back skin to expose bone. But if Amara was there, if the dust of those forgotten streets held the key to her absence, then he would go. Obinna kept the plan secret. Only Musa, his longtime driver, and Uche, a discreet bodyguard, were told. At dawn, under the cover of silence, they loaded the SUV. Obinna insisted on sitting upright in the back seat despite the strain. This was no journey for comfort. Lagos disappeared behind them in a haze of traffic fumes and restless horns. The expressway stretched long, flanked by forests and towns, until the rhythms of Enugu began to rise. Red earth under wheels, hawkers waving roasted corn at bus windows, the music of Igbo dialects threading through the air like ancestral drums. It was jarring and beautiful. The man who once closed billion-dollar deals over foie gras now found his heart swelling at the sight of a woman fanning a kara on a roadside grill. He bought corn from a boy barefoot in dust, peeling the husk with hands still calloused from the past. Power cuts struck the first evening, lanterns glowed in compounds, and children played unbothered in the dark. For Obinna, it was a baptism, a reminder that life pulsed without excess, that dignity could thrive in scarcity. Whispers followed him everywhere. Not of his wealth, though some recognized his face from magazine covers, but of Amara. She is the nurse who buys medicine for children when their parents cannot. She pays school fees, quietly. She is always at the clinic, even on Sundays. The stories painted her not as a runaway opportunist, but as a giver rooted in simplicity. His chest tightened with both pride and ache. He found her at last in a rural health center, a low building painted cream, its walls streaked by rain, its benches filled with patients waiting patiently in the sweltering heat. Amara was inside, her white coat slightly frayed, her hair tied in a scarf, moving from patient to patient with the calm efficiency of someone who had given herself fully to service. She looked smaller here, stripped of Lagos's glitz, yet infinitely larger in spirit. When she saw him in the doorway, her hands froze, the stethoscope slipping slightly against her patient's chest. For a heartbeat, the room stilled. Then she excused herself, stepped outside, and the air between them filled with unspoken history. "Why did you leave?" Obinna's voice cracked, not with anger, but with the raw edge of abandonment. Her eyes brimmed but held steady. "They came to me," she said softly. "Your siblings. They told me if I stayed, they would destroy you, completely strip your companies, ruin your name. They said I was your weakness. I thought leaving was the only way to protect you." Obinna felt the ground shift beneath him. She had not left for money, nor out of fear for herself. She had left for him. For his survival. The betrayal he thought he felt turned to a different kind of wound, one born of sacrifice. "You think I wanted to go?" Her voice broke then, tears tracing her cheeks. "Every night, I missed you, but I couldn't watch them kill everything you built because of me. I thought disappearing would give you a chance." He wheeled closer, his own tears unrestrained. "I don't need a chance without you, Amara. They can take buildings, companies, even my legs. But you." His hand reached for hers, trembling, desperate. "You are the only empire I refuse to lose." Their reconciliation was not gentle. It was fiery, a storm of tears, accusations, apologies, and promises. She clung to him as though she could erase the months of silence with touch alone. He buried his face in her shoulder, inhaling the scent of antiseptic and shea butter, grounding himself in her reality. Words spilled between sobs of regret, of forgiveness, of the future they would not surrender again. By dusk, they sat together beneath a mango tree outside the clinic, watching the sky bruise purple. "Come back with me," Obinna whispered. "Not as a secret, not as someone they can shame. Come back as my partner, my equal, the woman I will defend, no matter the cost." Amara hesitated, her fingers tracing circles on his palm. Then she nodded. "If you promise never to let silence divide us again." "I swear it," he said. The vow etched deeper than any contract he had ever signed. The journey back to Lagos carried a different weight. This time, the SUV hummed with hope, with whispered plans of building together. The city skyline emerged again, tall and gleaming, but Obinna's eyes were fixed on Amara, her hand steady in his. But joy does not remain unchallenged in a house where betrayal has already dined. The moment they entered the mansion, Chinello was waiting in the grand hall, her posture regal, her eyes sharp with disdain. She glanced at Amara, then back at her brother. "You have a choice to make, Obinna," she said coldly. "Her or us. If you keep her, you lose the family, and if you lose the family, you may lose everything else." The mansion's great hall was thick with tension, the marble floor cold beneath the wheels of Obinna's chair as he faced his sister's ultimatum. Chinello's voice cut like a scalpel. "Choose her, and you choose exile. Choose us, and you retain the empire." The words hung between them, heavy as chains. Nwachukwu stepped forward, lips curling into a smirk that concealed a blade. "And remember," he added, his tone mocking, "I know things, secrets. Do you want me to open them to the world? Father's deals, your early investors, the truth about how Nebula was born? One headline, and your empire burns." It was the cruelest blow. Family was supposed to be shield, not sword. Yet here they stood, wielding blood ties like weapons. Around them, board members invited under the guise of a family mediation shifted uneasily, their gazes betrayed calculation. Chinello and Nwachukwu had whispered in their ears for months, painting Obinna as a liability, Amara as a parasite. Now, with the confrontation staged in public, the directors leaned subtly toward his sibling's side. Power was gravity, they followed where it pulled. Obinna glanced at Amara beside him. She stood without flinching, chin lifted, her presence as steady as a lighthouse. He drew strength from her silence. Once, he might have faltered under nostalgia, under fear of isolation, but not now, not with her hand brushing lightly against his shoulder, reminding him that loyalty was not a bargain to be negotiated, it was a bond chosen freely. He exhaled slowly, then spoke. If you think I will trade love for power, then you never knew me. If you think threats will bend me, then you have forgotten who built this house." His voice did not rise, but its quiet conviction filled the hall. "Nebula does not belong to you. It never did. And today, I will prove it." From his console, he projected documents onto the room's vast screen, restructuring blueprints, legal filings signed and sealed. Dee's brilliance shone in every clause. Effective immediately, his siblings were stripped of influence. Their board seats revoked, their access terminated, their names erased from the corporate hierarchy. Instead, Nebula would be governed by a trust, the Aurora Foundation dedicated to innovation and philanthropy, with Obinna as lifetime chair and Amara as co-trustee. The gasps around the room rippled like thunder. Chinello's face blanched, then hardened. Tobichukwu's smirk collapsed into a curse. The board members, sensing the tide had turned, straightened quickly, offering cautious applause. The balance of power shifted in real time, and by the time the meeting ended, Obinna had done what no one believed possible. He had cut his betrayers out completely. The media devoured the spectacle. Headlines splashed across every platform. Obinna Nwachukwu reclaims his throne. From wheelchair to warfare, the billionaire's resurrection. Talk shows replayed footage of the restructuring announcement, marveling at his resilience. Analysts praised his foresight, influencers lauded Amara as his silent strength, and international outlets framed the story as proof of Nigeria's new brand of tech titans, scarred, but unbroken. Within days, Obinna's health began to reflect his spirit's renewal. Physiotherapists noted his progress, longer stretches, stronger grips, the faint twitch of a muscle once thought dormant. He began working later hours without collapse, his appetite returning, his laughter occasional but real. Amara's presence infused his recovery with rhythm. Together they walked the corridors of the mansion, she with her steady stride, he with determination inching forward on braces. For the first time in months, victory felt tangible not just in contracts and headlines, but in heartbeat and breath. Yet, beneath the noise of celebration, silence gathered in corners. Chinello and Tobichukwu did not rant in public. They did not contest in court. They retreated, masks of defeat plastered on their faces. But Obinna knew his siblings too well. Retreat was not surrender. It was plotting. The stillness was not peace. It was storm clouds waiting for the right wind. He told himself he would be ready, that no betrayal could surprise him again, that this chapter was closed. But fate writes in ink darker than human foresight. The night of his victory, party arrived with spectacle. Guests filled the mansion once more, glasses of champagne clinking under chandeliers. Journalists broadcast live, influencers streamed every corner, and the lagoon outside shimmered as if honoring its favorite son. The music soared. Obinna, though seated, lifted a glass high, his eyes wet with gratitude. Amara stood beside him, radiant, her smile wide enough to erase months of pain. For a moment, it seemed the empire had been restored not just in law but in soul. Then, without warning, the music died. The chandeliers flickered, sputtered, and went dark. The screens froze. Generators failed to hum. Silence fell heavy, broken only by startled gasps. The mansion, once glowing like a beacon, was plunged into absolute darkness. And Obinna's victory, only hours old, suddenly felt fragile again. The blackout arrived like a thief, stealing laughter and music from the air. One moment, the chandeliers spilled golden light across the ballroom, and the next, the mansion was plunged into silence and shadow. Guests muttered nervously, their sequined dresses and tuxedos shimmering faintly in the glow of hastily lit candles. Waiters scrambled to steady trays, the lagoon outside blackened into a mirror of uncertainty. It was as if the night itself had staged a test, one final challenge to weigh the strength of the man whose story had captured a nation. All eyes turned toward Obinna. For a heartbeat, the room held its breath, waiting to see if the fall of light would echo the fall of courage. But he did not shrink. With slow determination, he wheeled himself forward, the quiet hum of his chair replacing the absent music. Shadows cut across his face, but his eyes burned with clarity. A staff member placed a tall candle in his hand, and the flame danced against his features like prophecy. "My friends," he began, his voice carrying into the darkness, "tonight, the lights may fail, but our spirit must not. You see me here not as the man who once walked with untouchable pride, but as the man who was broken and rebuilt. My empire is not marble floors or towering glass walls. It is resilience. It is the fire that refuses to go out, even in the darkest night." The guests leaned closer, captivated. In candlelight, His words seemed etched in stone. They thought my fall was my end. They thought a chair could erase a crown. But look around you, Nebula stands stronger than ever, not because of wealth alone, but because of love, because of loyalty, because of the courage to begin again. He turned slightly, his hand reaching for Amara. She stepped into the circle of light, her presence radiant, her scarf catching the glow like a halo. The murmurs in the crowd grew louder, admiration rippling like a tide. Obinna's voice softened but deepened with meaning. This woman stood when others fled. She gave me laughter when silence devoured me, strength when betrayal drained me. Tonight, she is not just at my side, she is my partner, my compass, the heart of the empire I rebuild. Applause erupted, first tentative, then thunderous. Guests rose to their feet, their claps echoing against the high ceilings. Some wiped tears discreetly, others cheered openly, chanting his name. Obinna, Obinna! The energy surged through the hall, not as pity, but as celebration, a collective recognition that the man before them was no longer defined by his paralysis, but by his unbroken will. Across the room, his siblings stood in shadow, their faces masks of bitterness. Chinello's jaw tightened, Tobichukwu's eyes darted restlessly. They had lost more than control of a company. They had lost the narrative, the power to define their brother as weak. The guests ignored them, the spotlight stolen completely by the man they had tried to erase. For the first time, they realized the throne was not theirs to claim. Obinna lifted his glass of champagne, the flame flickering dangerously close to the rim. Tonight, he declared, we mark not just a victory of business, but of spirit. They call me a billionaire, but wealth is not my legacy, and the belief that no fall is final. His hand squeezed Amara's, and he leaned toward her, whispering words that only she could hear, though the audience sensed the intimacy in the gesture. One day, Amara, I will walk again, not just in dreams, in truth. And when I do, it will be with you beside me. Her eyes glistened, her smile trembling with both hope and love. The room around them roared again in approval, glasses clinking, hearts lifted. In that candlelit moment, Obinna felt the darkness no longer as a threat, but as a canvas against which his flame shone brighter than ever. Yet, even as joy swept through the hall, a different story brewed in the corners where shadows lingered. For when the applause reached its peak and the chants thundered through the mansion, a camera hidden, discreet, caught Chinello's face. She did not clap. She did not smile with sincerity. Instead, her lips curved into a cold, restrained grin, her eyes glinting with a promise of unfinished war. The nation might believe the saga had closed with triumph, that the billionaire had been resurrected by love and resilience. But in that single frozen smile, the truth lay heavy. Empires are never safe, families never fully healed, and battles never entirely over. The lights flickered once more, humming back to life as generators finally caught. Music returned, champagne flowed again, and the night resumed its performance. Yet, for Obinna, the real drama had shifted into a quieter register, the suspense of tomorrow, the vigilance required, when victory makes enemies desperate. He raised his glass again, smiled at his guests, leaned closer to Amara, and let the applause wash over him like rain on scorched ground. But deep within, he knew this was not the end. It was only the dawn. Camera pans to Chinello's cold smile in the shadows, hinting the battle may not be over.